There's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or obvious villains. It's the kind that wears the face of love for 20 years before it shows you its true teeth, and by then, you're so deep in the forest of trust that you can't see the wolves circling until they've already tasted your blood. My name's Claire. I'm 30 years old, and this is the story of how my childhood best friend, Evelyn, stole a project I poured 3 years of my life into, and how I got my revenge. I'm telling this story not because I need your sympathy or your judgment, but because there's something almost beautiful about the mathematics of revenge when it's done properly. What I did to her, some would call justice, others would call it systematic destruction, but I call it the only honest conversation we ever had. Memory has a way of editing itself, smoothing the rough edges, adding golden light where there was probably just fluorescent buzzing overhead, but I remember exactly how it felt the first time Eve chose me, the way her attention landed on my 7-year-old self like sunlight through a magnifying glass. She had just pushed Melissa Henderson off the coveted tire swing, not with malice, but with the casual certainty of someone who had never questioned their right to take what they wanted. And when she turned to me, those jade eyes already calculating, she said something that should have been my first warning. I collect friends like stickers. Want to be my special one? Sit with me, and I'll teach you cool stuff. For the next 15 years, we built what I thought was love, but what I now understand was the most sophisticated form of emotional architecture I've ever encountered. Every shared secret was another brick in the wall she was building around me. Every late-night conversation, another wire in the net she was weaving, and I was so grateful to be chosen, so hungry to belong to someone who seemed to burn brighter than everyone else, that I never noticed how she collected my vulnerabilities like a surgeon studying anatomy. We carved our names into the old oak behind the school with her father's pocket knife, C+E forever, in letters deep enough to scar the bark permanently, and she made me promise under that tree. Her hand gripping mine so tight it left crescent-shaped marks from her nails. Swear to me, Claire, that no matter what happens, no matter who tries to come between us or what the world throws at us, it'll always be us against everything else, because people like us, people who understand each other the way we do, we're rare. And rare things have to protect each other. I swore it with the fervor of a convert, never realizing that when she said us against everything else, she meant me against everything else while she positioned herself to inherit whatever was left standing. Senior year brought Daniel Morrison into my world like the first warm day after a brutal winter, quiet in that way that suggests depth rather than emptiness. The kind of boy who remembered that I took my coffee with too much cream and not enough sugar. Who would leave little notes tucked between the pages of the books I was reading with observations that made me feel less alone in my own thoughts. I spent weeks working up the courage to tell Eve about the way my heart performed complicated gymnastics every time he smiled at me, and when I finally confessed it, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the detritus of our childhood, college brochures and SAT prep books scattered like the bones of our future, she leaned forward with what I mistook for excitement, her eyes bright with what I now know was opportunity. Oh God, Claire, this is perfect. Daniel Morrison is exactly the kind of boy who needs someone like you, someone who can see past all that surface quiet to whatever's burning underneath. And you know what? I think he's been waiting for you to notice him too. The way he looks at you when you're not looking, like he's trying to solve some beautiful equation. 3 days later, 3 days, I walked into the cafeteria with my plastic tray and my carefully rehearsed casual questions about weekend plans, only to find Eve draped across Daniel's lap like a claim staked in territory I hadn't even known was contested. Her fingers tangled in his hair while she whispered something that made him laugh in a way I'd never heard before, low and intimate and completely hers. When I confronted her that afternoon, cornered her really, backed her up against her locker like some desperate animal, she looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I were speaking a language she'd never learned. "Claire, honey, you're being dramatic." Daniel came to me, not the other way around, and honestly, if you really wanted him, you would have done something about it instead of writing poetry in your journal and hoping the universe would deliver him gift-wrapped to your door. I'm not responsible for your inability to act on your own desires. That night, lying in my narrow twin bed staring at the ceiling where we'd stuck glow-in-the-dark stars in the constellation patterns she'd insisted on, I realized that Eve didn't see boundaries between what belonged to her and what belonged to me in her world. There was only what she wanted and what she was willing to take, and my feelings were just weather patterns she had to navigate around to get where she was going. But I told myself it was immaturity, growing pains, the inevitable friction of two people learning how to be adults, because the alternative, that the person I loved most in the world saw me as something to be harvested rather than cherished, was too much for my 19-year-old heart to accept. 5 years later, I landed my dream job at a top marketing firm. Sterling Marketing was the kind of small firm where individual effort actually mattered, where Richard Sterling himself would stop by your desk to discuss campaign strategies and remember your ideas in Monday morning meetings. And for the first time in my adult life, I had something that was genuinely mine, something I'd earned through merit rather than inherited through proximity to someone more magnetic. I should have known better than to share the details with Eve, should have learned from the Daniel Morrison lesson that anything I treasured became automatically interesting to her, but there's something about old habits that makes them feel like moral obligations, and so I told her everything. How Richard had praised my work on the Pemberton Industries account, how he was considering promoting me to senior associate, how for the first time since we'd graduated, I felt like I was building something that couldn't be taken away. During our late-night phone calls, and Eve always preferred to call late, when defenses were down and thoughts moved slower, she would sigh with what sounded like genuine admiration. "I'm so proud of you, Claire, really. Watching you find your place in the world, seeing you finally get the recognition you deserve, it makes me believe that maybe there's room for both of us to succeed. Maybe we don't have to compete for the same small slice of happiness." But there was something else threading through her voice during those conversations, something hungry and calculating that I could name then but recognize now as the sound of someone doing inventory, cataloging assets and weaknesses with the methodical precision of a battlefield strategist. The morning Richard called me into his office, his face arranged in an expression I'd never seen before, disappointed, suspicious, almost sad. I knew before he spoke that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of my life. "Claire, I need to address some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your commitment to this company and your discretion with sensitive information. I've been told that you've been expressing dissatisfaction with your position here, that you're actively interviewing elsewhere, and that you may have shared strategic details about the Pemberton account with individuals outside the company." The words hit me like physical blows. Each accusation so specific, so perfectly crafted to exploit Richard's greatest fears about employee loyalty, that I knew immediately this wasn't random office gossip but a precision strike designed by someone who understood exactly how to wound me. "Mr. Sterling, I swear to you I've never, who told you this? Because it's not true. None of it is true, and I can prove." But his mind was already made up, poisoned by someone who knew exactly which lies would take root and flourish in the soil of his entrepreneurial paranoia. That evening, standing in Eve's doorway with my termination letter crumpled in my fist, I saw it immediately. That little smile playing at the corners of her mouth, the way she held her head slightly tilted, as if she were listening to music only she could hear. "Oh, Claire, sweetheart, don't look at me like that. I was only sharing my concerns with someone who clearly cared about you enough to listen, and if Richard misunderstood the nature of our conversation, well, maybe that says more about his insecurities than it does about my intentions. Besides, Now you'll have time to figure out what you really want instead of settling for the first job that made you feel important. She twisted the knife with surgical precision, then bandaged the wound with false concern, and for the first time, I understood that I wasn't dealing with immaturity or jealousy, but with something far more dangerous. A person who could destroy my life while convincing herself she was saving me from my own mediocrity. A month later, I decided to bid my own company, TruePath. TruePath wasn't just an idea. It was 3 years of my life distilled into elegant code and revolutionary algorithms, born from the realization that most people spend their careers in jobs that slowly suffocate their souls not because they're lazy or stupid, but because no one had ever taught them how to decode their own potential and match it with work that would feed their spirits instead of draining them. I built it in the spaces between other obligations, weekends and late nights and early mornings when the rest of the world was sleeping, writing code until my eyes burned, testing algorithms until I could see the patterns in my dreams, creating something that felt like the first honest thing I'd ever made. Eve was fascinated by every detail, asking questions that made me feel like a real entrepreneur instead of just someone playing at being important, encouraging me to dream bigger and think beyond the limitations I'd imposed on my own ambitions. Claire, this isn't just a business idea. This is going to change how people think about work, about purpose, about the relationship between what we do for money and who we are in our hearts. You're not just building a platform, you're building a bridge between people's authentic selves and their professional lives. When she suggested we partner up, sitting across from me at Cafe Luna, where we'd spent countless hours planning our futures, her eyes bright with what I interpreted as shared excitement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, the possibility of having everything I wanted and sharing it with the person I loved most. Think about it, Claire, TruePath by Claire and Eve, 2 women who've been dreaming together since we were children, who understand each other's strengths and can cover each other's blind spots. We could build something that's not just successful but meaningful, something that proves friendship can be the foundation for the kind of empire that changes the world. Every instinct I developed through years of small betrayals screamed at me to protect what I'd built, to keep this one thing sacred and separate from the complicated dynamics of our relationship. But when someone has been the constant in your life for 18 years, when they know exactly which words will unlock every defense you've carefully constructed, when they're offering you the chance to have both success and love, I said yes. For 3 months, she was the perfect partner, asking all the right questions, offering brilliant insights about user experience and market positioning, staying up late with me to refine pitch presentations and financial projections. I thought we were building something together, thought I was finally experiencing what it meant to share success instead of competing for it. Then Eve vanished from my life as completely as if she'd been erased. Calls went straight to voicemail, texts disappeared into digital silence, emails bounced back with automated responses about extended travel. I told myself she was having second thoughts, maybe overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were attempting to build together. Until I turned on Bloomberg Business at 7 in the morning and watched my entire life's work presented to a panel of investors by a woman who had learned to speak my language fluently enough to steal my voice. Good morning, I'm Evelyn Carter, founder and CEO of TruePath, and I'm here to show you how we're revolutionizing the relationship between human potential and professional fulfillment through proprietary AI algorithms that can decode individual strengths and match them with career paths that don't just pay the bills, but feed the soul. She had memorized every word of our pitch, every statistic I'd researched, every vision I'd shared during those late-night conversations when I'd trusted her with the architecture of my dreams, and she delivered it with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to stand in that room and claim credit for work that had stolen 3 years of my life. When I finally reached her, when she deigned to answer her phone after 47 calls, her voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like pity. "Oh, Claire, I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Listen, this is just business. Nothing personal. You're brilliant at creating things, but you don't have what it takes to sell them, to fight for them in rooms full of people who would eat you alive just for sport. I'm doing what you never could, making sure your ideas actually matter in the world instead of dying in some notebook you're too afraid to show anyone. That conversation lasted 43 seconds and ended 20 years of what I had mistaken for love. It also began my education in the art of systematic revenge. Real revenge isn't a moment of cathartic violence. It's an extended meditation on justice, a careful study in cause and effect that requires the patience of a master craftsman and the precision of a surgeon who understands that the difference between healing and killing often comes down to a matter of millimeters. For 18 months, I watched Eve become everything I had dreamed of being. The darling of tech conferences where she spoke eloquently about innovation and female entrepreneurship, the subject of glowing profiles in business magazines that praised her vision and tenacity, the recipient of awards that should have carried my name. But Eve had always possessed one fatal weakness that I understood better than anyone. She was fundamentally lazy, intellectually arrogant in a way that made her believe her charm could substitute for competence, and she had never learned to cover her tracks because she had never imagined that anyone would dare to investigate her claims. I began collecting evidence with the methodical obsession of an archivist. Screenshots of conversations where she admitted her technical limitations, recordings of phone calls where she begged me to explain concepts she couldn't grasp, email threads documenting every moment when she had relied on my expertise to solve problems that supposedly genius founders should have been able to handle independently. But evidence without strategy is just noise, so I spent months learning the ecosystem that had elevated her, studying her investors' pet peeves and professional insecurities, mapping the relationships between board members, and identifying which journalists were hungry for stories that would distinguish them from the pack of sycophantic tech coverage that passed for business reporting. At networking events and industry conferences, I began planting seeds with the careful precision of a master gardener. Never accusations, never direct challenges to her credibility, just subtle questions that lodged themselves in the minds of people who made decisions about where to invest their money and their reputations. Isn't it fascinating how quickly Eve mastered the technical aspects of TruePath? I remember her saying in college that she found programming impossibly abstract, but I suppose people can surprise you when the stakes are high enough. Each conversation was carefully calibrated to exploit specific anxieties. Her lead investors' paranoia about being fooled by charismatic founders, her board members' concerns about due diligence, her biggest client's obsession with intellectual property protection. When I had assembled enough evidence to destroy her reputation 10 times over, when I had identified exactly which people needed to receive exactly which information to maximum effect, I crafted a package that would have impressed a prosecutor building a case for fraud. Every lie documented, every theft proven, every moment of dishonesty preserved with the clarity of high-definition video. I sent it anonymously to 5 carefully selected recipients on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:15 a.m., when emails were most likely to be read immediately and shared with colleagues before lunch. There's something beautiful about watching a lie collapse under the weight of truth, the way it happens slowly at first, then all at once, like a building whose foundation has been quietly eroding for months before the final earthquake brings everything down in a cascade of inevitability. Within 6 hours, Eve's lead investor had called an emergency board meeting. Within 24 hours, the tech journalist who had written the most flattering profile of her published a correction that was more devastating than any direct attack could have been. Within 48 hours, her biggest client had not only terminated their contract, but demanded a full audit of the intellectual property they had licensed. She called me at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, her voice stripped of every defense I had ever heard her deploy. "Claire, what did you do to me?" I let the silence stretch between us until it became its own form of communication, until she understood that I was no longer the person who could be manipulated by appeals to our shared history or confused by her practiced explanations of why her betrayals were actually acts of love. I told the truth, Eve. I documented every lie you told. Every idea vous stole. Every person vous deceived in service of building an empire on the foundation of my work, and then I shared that documentation with people who had the power to do something about it. We met one final time at Café Luna, the same place where she had convinced me to trust her with my dreams, and when I saw her sitting in our old corner booth, I barely recognized the woman who had once commanded every room she entered with the gravitational pull of pure confidence. Her hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. Her designer clothes looked like costumes she no longer knew how to wear, and when she looked at me, I saw something I had never seen before in her eyes. The recognition that she had finally encountered a force she could not charm, manipulate, or overcome. "You destroyed everything I built," she whispered, and for the first time in 20 years, her voice carried no trace of performance or calculation, just raw, unfiltered devastation. I leaned across the table, close enough to see the fine lines that stress had carved around her eyes, close enough to smell the fear that no amount of expensive perfume could mask. "No, Eve, you destroyed everything you stole from me, and I simply made sure that people would eventually learn the truth. The only thing I destroyed was the lie you built your life on, and if that feels like everything to you, maybe you should have spent more time building something original instead of taking what belonged to other people." 3 years have passed since that final conversation, and I've built TruePath into everything I originally envisioned. Not just a successful platform, but a genuine force for helping people discover work that feeds their souls instead of slowly killing them. The kind of company that proves business can be both profitable and meaningful when it's built on foundation of authentic vision rather than borrowed dreams. Eve has disappeared from the world where we used to compete, at last I heard through the gossip networks that connect all small professional communities. She was working at a mid-level marketing firm in Portland, using her real name again, finally doing work that matches her actual abilities rather than the inflated reputation she built on stolen foundations. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep has abandoned me and I'm alone with the complexity of what I've done, I think about that 7-year-old girl who chose me on the playground, who promised we would be sisters forever, who taught me that being chosen could feel like the most important thing in the world. I wonder if there was ever a version of this story where we both got what we needed without destroying what we had, where her hunger for recognition and my need for belonging could have coexisted without one of us having to consume the other to survive. But then I remember the sound of her laugh when she told me that stealing my life's work was just business. The casual cruelty with which she dismissed 20 years of shared history as if it were nothing more than a business transaction she had executed with admirable efficiency. And I remind myself that some people teach us about love by showing us its opposite, that some friendships end not because they were never real, but because one person decides that what the other person has built is more valuable than what they built together. Eve made me her enemy the moment she decided that my dreams were raw material for her ambitions, and I made sure she understood the consequences of that decision with the same methodical precision she had used to dismantle my trust. People ask me if I feel satisfied, if revenge brought me the peace I was looking for, but they misunderstand the nature of what I accomplished. This was never about satisfaction or peace. This was about balance. About ensuring that the universe contained at least one example of actions having appropriate consequences, of theft being met with justice, of someone who had spent her life taking from others finally learning what it felt like to lose everything. And in that sense, it was perfect. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, You understand that recovery isn't just about healing, it's about reclaiming your power to write your own story instead of letting someone else edit you out of the narrative you helped create. Leave me a comment about the friendships that shaped you, the betrayals that taught you, or the moments when you had to choose between loyalty and self-preservation, because these stories matter, and the people who survive them deserve to be heard.